Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening. So you're looking at the third lecture in our Research Skills Analysis of Variance course. So here we go again. Let me share my screen with you, and I'll walk you through the third lecture in our course. Right, there we go. Right, so this is the lecture for the third week. So this is very similar to the lecture that students normally see, but usually, of course, this happens on campus, and now this happens on YouTube. So before we really start, I wanted to share with you once more that I've placed on Canvas those checklists. So several people asked me whether they were doing things in the correct way. For instance, testing the right number of assumptions for different analysis. And several people also asked me how to report several things. So therefore, I've been sharing those checklists such that you basically have a step-by-step way of doing an analysis, all the way from summarizing the aim of your study and specifying the hypothesis to giving some details about the methods, and then obviously reporting the results. So of course, as you can see here, you define which analysis you exactly did, what the dependent and independent variables were, etc. And then there's a nice part, I think, about checking assumptions. So based on the book, I think it's obvious that there are many, many assumptions that you can test, especially for multiple regression analysis. So here in this checklist, you have a nice list of the different things that you can do and that you should do when you're checking those assumptions. So if you just follow the checklist, you can tick the boxes if you're done with the several items on the list, and then you should be fine. Right, one other thing here to say perhaps is that for multiple regression, those assumptions are quite extensive, right? So there are many things you can do, but for the other types of analysis, this is a bit better. So there are fewer assumptions to test there. Then also during the Q&A session last week, we thought it was a good idea to perhaps show online how you check all those assumptions, right? Especially for multiple regression analysis, because there are so many. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to make a bonus video in which I'm checking all those assumptions myself on a data set that we all have. So I'll just go through this step by step in a separate video so that you can see actually how those things should be done. But I decided to post this only online only next week, so on week 4 of the course, because if I already post this now, then I'm going to tell you that assignment 1 is going to be very, very simple for you. So my suggestion would be that for assignment 1, you try to find out those things yourself. So if you follow the checklist, then you're doing fine. And then in the book, it is specified how you should check those assumptions. And I think in this way, you will learn more compared to when I just put the video online and you just follow that. So for this week, for assignment 1, you'll find this out yourself if you follow the book and if you follow the checklist. And then for next week, you can also confirm that you're doing things well by checking this this bonus video that I'll put online. All right, coming soon. So yeah, a bit more info about assignment 1. So I hope you started working on this. So the deadline again is end of the 3rd week, so 26th of April. And basically on Canvas, there's all the information you need. And as you probably know by now, this will count for 15% of your grade. You're allowed to work on this together as long as you hand in your own individual report in which you phrase things in your own words. Yeah, then some recurring questions that came to me via email or during the Q&A session that I thought would be good to briefly discuss also in this video lecture, such that everyone's on the same page. So a couple of people asked me, now what's actually the difference between multiple regression and hierarchical regression? Because different people are using this sort of in different ways or in the same way. What does this actually mean? Is there a difference between the two? So remember that both multiple regression and hierarchical regression contrast with what's called simple regression, right? So in case of simple regression, there's one dependent variable and there's one predictor, one independent variable. So that's basically a correlation, so very simple regression. In the case of multiple regression, it's called multiple because there are multiple predictors. So there are multiple independent variables. This is also what we've seen in the practice assignment so far. So there, for instance, we entered in total 3 different predictors into the model. And therefore, it's called multiple regression because there are multiple predictors. Now then, what's hierarchical regression? Well, hierarchical refers to the way those predictors are entered into the model. So in the practice assignment for week 1, those predictors were entered hierarchically. So first, one predictor was entered because based on the literature, we expected this predictor to have a large effect. And then in a second step, those other 2 predictors were added to the model. So there was a hierarchy. It was first one predictor, and then in the next step, two additional predictors were entered. So this is why multiple regression is sometimes called hierarchical regression, in cases where those multiple predictors are entered hierarchically, in some hierarchical way. So hierarchical regression is always a form of multiple regression, but not the other way around. So you can also have multiple regression where all your variables are entered into your model at the same time. So then there's no hierarchy, so then it's not hierarchical regression, then it's just multiple regression. Then a second point, some people already started looking also at this mediation analysis, which is great. And they were wondering what are the assumptions that there should be checked in the case of mediation analysis. So another nice thing, of course, now is that you have those checklists, so there you can find it. But one important thing to mention there is that people typically do this mediation analysis after they have done a multiple regression or a hierarchical regression analysis. So first, all the assumptions are being checked for the multiple regression analysis. And then once that analysis has been done, as a sort of extra step, they typically use this process macro to also do an additional mediation analysis, which means that you already checked all the assumptions for your data set for mediation analysis in this previous step when you did the regression analysis. So there are no new additional assumptions that you have to check there. So that's good news, I guess. And then finally, one thing that came up in relation to earlier topics in this course is this difference between R square and adjusted R square. So here, basically, sometimes people report R square, right, to tell how good actually your model is doing, how good the fit of your model is. And sometimes people report this adjusted R square measure. So the question is, when should you report the one? When should you report the other? Well, here actually also people do different things. So some people prefer to report this R square measure. Other researchers prefer to report the adjusted R square measure. In principle, you can report either of them, either the one or the other, as long as you mention which one you are reporting. So the adjusted R square is a bit more conservative. So it's typically a bit lower, a value a bit lower than the R square value itself. And then if you report this, you're a bit more conservative. So you say the fit of my model is a bit lower than when you would report the R square value, but typically also those values are very close. In principle, it doesn't matter much as long as you just mention whether you report the R square value itself or an adjusted version of it. All right, so those were some of the topics and questions that came up last week via email in the Q&A session. So now you're sort of all on the same page about this. And for today, the topic for today is actually repeated measures ANOVAs and also mixed ANOVAs. As I said before, those are actually the final topics. So this is typically also the final lecture. So in this course, if you remember, the first 3 weeks are pretty intense, right? Every week there are new topics and there are new activities. And in the first 3 weeks, there's always this lecture in the first half of class, typically. And then after the first 3 weeks, there's just a lot of practice. So during the classes, typically starting from week 4, there's no more lecture, there's only practice assignments. So therefore also today, this is the first, this is the last typical lecture in this course. But if I notice, or if you tell me that there's something more that you could use, that you would need in this course for you to understand things better, that wouldn't just work via email or via the Q&A sessions, then let me know. And then I'll make some more bonus videos, as I will do, related to those assumptions in multiple regression. So there might be more coming up, but we'll see. This, in any case, this is the last final regular lecture. Yeah, as I said, from week 4, typically that's just practice, 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 because that's how you will learn in the end. And this is a skills course, so you will learn the skills in the end just by practicing. All right, so this is the topic for today. And there's actually some good news to share with you, because actually those two types of ANOVAs, so repeated measures ANOVAs, and also mixed ANOVAs, are very similar in many ways compared to the factorial ANOVAs that we discussed in week 2. So it basically compares, again, multiple group means, or actually, if you want to put it more precisely, it compares the variance across various group means, as we've learned last week. And it again tests, in the case of repeated measures analysis of variance, it again tests for a difference between all groups. So even if you have 25 different conditions and groups in your experiment, the basic ANOVA, the basic repeated measures ANOVA in this case, will just tell you whether there's a difference between groups. And it won't tell you yet what that difference actually is. And as we've seen last week, also for repeated measures analysis, actually, then you can do some follow-up tests, like post hoc tests, to find out which groups, which conditions actually differ from each other. So that's the same for repeated measures ANOVAs. However, there's one very critical, very important difference with those factorial ANOVAs that we looked at last week. So far in this course, we've only been looking at between subject factors. So we were always comparing different groups, right? So for instance, we were comparing young people with old people, or we were comparing people with a low socioeconomic status to people with a high socioeconomic status. So there are always different groups of subjects, different groups of participants to be compared. Well, in case of repeated measures ANOVAs, the groups that we compare, so the conditions that we compare, are actually within participants, they're within subjects. And there are two typical situations in which you would use this repeated measures analysis. The first one is that the same entities, so for instance, the same participants, participate in all conditions of your experiment. So you can think of an experiment where you have different conditions, and basically every participant does all the conditions. And then you just compare the different conditions within the same participant. That's one example. I'll give a specific example on the next slide. The other example in which you would typically use a repeated measures analysis is when the same entities, so again, the same participants, provide data at multiple time points. So this often happens in the medical field. So there it often happens that, for instance, you do a certain pre-measurement, a certain pre-test. Then you give participants or patients some medication. And then later on, you again measure them after the treatment. So then you get a measurement before the treatment and after the treatment. So you have repeated measures on the same participants, on the same patients. So there also typically repeated measures analysis are being used. And actually what's nice is that in this analysis, the interpretation, so the theoretical interpretation of your factors, of your independent variables, is very similar to how this was before last week in the factorial ANOVAs. So nothing new basically there. All right, let's perhaps more explicitly compare those two types of ANOVAs, the one that we saw last week, factorial ANOVA, and the one that we are looking at now, the repeated measures ANOVA, to clarify this a bit more. So in the factorial ANOVA, basically, as I said, there are those between participants factors. Typically, then also participants are randomly assigned to different conditions. For instance, in an experiment that could look like this. So one person asked me in the Q&A session whether there could be a bit more different examples. So here's one. So imagine you're interested in whether people behave differently when they're chatting with a chatbot compared to when they're chatting with a human interlocutor. So in an experiment, what you could do then is that you take half of your participants and you let them chat with a chatbot. And then the other half of your participants chats with a human interlocutor. And then you compare those two groups, right? And since you're comparing those two groups, it would be appropriate to do this factorial ANOVA because you now have this between subject factor. Half of your participants does one thing, the other half of the participants does the other thing, and then you compare those two groups. And here we learned last week that then there's, again, of course, an assumption, because there are always assumptions that need to be checked. And this was this assumption of homogeneous variance. And this basically means that in your two groups, or in several groups, if you compare more than two groups, the variance that's in your group should be more or less homogeneous. So it should be more or less the same. Basically meaning that the noise in your data in one group is more or less the same as in the other group. So you can imagine that if in one of your two groups, everybody's sick and nobody's really paying attention to the experiment, you get a lot of noise. And if in your other group that's not the case, this is sort of a confound, right? So this assumption tests this, whether this noise in your data due to factors that you don't have any control over is more or less the same in the different groups. Well, if we then look at repeated measures ANOVAs, then as I said, there will be only within subject factors, only within participant factors. So participants do all the conditions in your experiment. So if we look at the same example, what you could do then is have half of your participants first chat with a chatbot, and then also have them chat with a human interlocutor. And for the other half of your subjects, they do the same thing, but the other way around. So you counterbalance things. So this means basically that all your participants have been taking part in both conditions in your experiment. Well, if this is the case, then you do a repeated measures ANOVA. And in this case, there's not the assumption of homogeneous variances, but there is a new assumption to be checked. And this is called the assumption of sphericity. So for some reason, for all those assumptions, there's a very polysyllabic long name for them. So here in this case, you should check the assumption of sphericity. And we'll talk about how to do this later. And you should only do this if your independent variable has more than 3 levels. So when it has 3 or more levels, so 3 or 4 or more. So now you might be wondering, when should so say you want to come up with an experiment yourself, right? Maybe in the context of your master's thesis. When should I make my design my experiment in such a way that I can do a factorial ANOVA? And when should I design my study in such a way that I could do a repeated measures ANOVA? Because principle for the same research question, as you can see here, you can do both things, right? Well, one reason to come up with a design for a factorial ANOVA would be when you, for instance, would have a very long test, a very long experiment already, such that if your participants would take part in all conditions, it would just take too long, right? Hours and hours. Otherwise, often a repeated measures design is actually preferred. Why is that the case? Well, that's the case because remember that there's always some noise in your data, right? And if you do a design for a factorial ANOVA, you're comparing two different groups. And it could be that in those different groups, there's different levels of variance, different levels of residuals and noise that you can't really control. So maybe by accident, in one of your groups, there are a couple of people not really paying attention, whereas in the other group, everyone's paying attention to your experiment. This creates sort of noise that is hard to control for. If you do a repeated measures design study, then all your participants take part in all conditions. So the individual noise that participants take with them to the experiment, to your test, will be the same in all conditions. So if one person is a bit sick that day when taking your experiment, that will lead to some noise in your data, but typically this noise would be the same in all conditions. So then you sort of balance this variance that you cannot really control, you already balance it across the different conditions. So that in many cases is actually preferred because you can compare conditions a bit more reliably. You can be a bit more sure that the noise in your different groups, in your different conditions is more or less the same. All right. So that was actually already partially the first topic, repeated measures analysis. Then also the other topic of this week is mixed analysis of variance. So you might already sort of start to feel what's coming now. So actually this mixed ANOVA combines elements of the factorial and the repeated measures ANOVA into one design. So again, it compares multiple group means as for all the other ANOVAs. And again, it tests for a difference between the groups. Is there any difference between groups? But in this case, in your study, so in your experiment, in your study, there are both within subjects variables and also between subjects variables, one or more. So now I hear you think, because of course I've been focusing quite a bit on assumptions, even though they're quite boring. What does that mean for assumption testing? Because for the Factorial ANOVAs, there was one group of assumptions, right? And for the repeated measures ANOVAs, there was this new, different assumption, right? The sphericity assumption. Well, here's the answer. The assumption of normality, right? We remember that, you remember that hopefully from last week, is being checked for between subject factors, right? And this basically means that in each group in your experiment, you test whether the data are normally distributed. That's still the case for a mixed ANOVA. And also remember last week, for the Factorial ANOVA, there's this assumption of homogeneous variances. And again, you test this when you do a mixed ANOVA, because again, there are between group variables. So for your between group variables, you will test whether this assumption of homogeneity holds. And as we learned last week, you do this with a so-called Levines test. This is something SPSS can just give you, right? So it can just give you, if you tick the right boxes, it can give you this Levines test. Of course, they're also within group variables. And for those variables, you look at this assumption of sphericity. And there's a different test. So there's not the Levines test, but there's the Markle's test of sphericity. This is also something even more easily that SPSS can just give you. And then if you tick the right box in your output, in your SPS output, you will get this box telling you the outcome of this Markle's test. So those are basically the things you should do. Test for normality for each group separately, so for within groups. If you're still comparing old people to young people, within each group you test for normality. And in addition to that, for a mixed ANOVA, you test for homogeneity for between group variables, and you test for sphericity and within group variables. Right, so this, of course, I agree that testing for all those assumptions is a bit annoying, right? Because you just want to know what's the outcome of my test, are my effects significant? Those kind of things are more interesting, right? But nevertheless, unfortunately, all those things have to be done. And if you follow the checklists, they can just do them one step at a time. And the good news then is if you do all of them, you can be more sure that actually your results are reliable. One thing to mention here, perhaps you will read in the book that Andy Field is not so much a fan of the Levines test and also not so much of the Markle's test. So what he says is you can basically just ignore those tests always and always correct your results in a certain way. If you agree with him, that's perfectly fine. Then you can just ignore those things. But if you ignore them, you should acknowledge that you ignore them in your report. And if you ignore them, it means that you have to do some corrections to your outcome. And let me show you what this basically means. So here is output from a mixed ANOVA being done in SPSS. And what you will get is a table with within subjects effects. And actually a very similar table, so also a table with within subjects effects, you will get when you do a repeated measures ANOVA. And what you basically see in those tables is that there are so-called main effects, remember? Here you see some lines for a main effect, and then you also see some tests for interaction effects. And here you see the second main effect, and you see another interaction effect. And then here you see another interaction effect, and here you even see a three-way interaction effect. So in this experiment, there were three different factors, three different independent variables. Let's call them, doesn't really matter now what they mean. Let's call them person, type, and age group. So then, of course, there could be a main effect of person or or personalization in this case, as you will learn in the practice assignment. Then there's the main effect of type. In this case, this refers to the type of a website. So those are two of the independent variables, and there can be interactions, right? So there can be an interaction between whether a website is personalized or what type of website it is. But as you also see here, there's all of a sudden this variable age group, right, which is not shown as a main effect here. So there's no single part of this graph where there's a main effect for age group being shown. That's the case because in this design, age group again was a between subject variable, and here you only see the within subject effects. In a different box that we'll go to later, you'll see the main effect of age group, in this case, in the between subjects box, because in this case, in this mixed ANOVA, age group was a between subject variable. One more thing here, if you then decide to ignore those assumptions, then there are typically corrections that you should carry out. And what's nice about mixed ANOVAs and about repeated measures ANOVAs is that already the output gives you what you could do if you correct for this assumption. So typically here, in this mixed ANOVA, you test for the assumption of sphericity. If you assume it, then you actually see it here. Then you take the top line of this box. If you, like Andy Field, don't care about sphericity, if you just ignore it, then you should take one of the two following lines here. So either you apply a greenhouse Geyser correction, then you take the second line, or you apply a Heinfeld correction, then you take the third line. And then you just report what's on those lines. Typically, actually, they're not that large of differences between those different options. The one thing that often differs is the so-called degrees of freedom that you should report. As you can also see here, if you, for instance, assume sphericity for type, for this variable, you get a degree of freedom of 2. But if you apply one of those corrections, you get, for instance, a degree of freedom of 1.8 or 1.9 here. And then you just report that. So you'll find in the book how to exactly report this. There was one more thing I wanted to say here. Let me think what it was. No, I don't remember. So in any case, you get this output box in SPSS. And then on the basis of this output box, you report one of the different options for the several main effects and for the interaction effects. Right, so here is if you want to test for this sphericity, then here's actually what you get. So you get this Mauchly's test of sphericity, and here it actually shows you for your within subject variables and for the interactions of your within subject variables, whether this test is significant. And remember that this test is only relevant when you have 3 or more levels in your independent variable. So in this case, for this first variable, there were only 2. So then this test is irrelevant in general. If there are 3 or more levels, like for this second factor here, this type factor, then this Mauchly's test tells you whether it's significant or not. If it's significant, and if you take it into account, you should use the correction. So then you should use either the Greenhouse-Geyser correction or the Heinfeld correction. That also brings me back to what I actually wanted to say here, which I just forgot. So you see there are 2 options, right? And now, of course, the question is which one should you report? There again, as often happens in statistics, different people have different opinions and different people have different preferences. Read about those 2 things in the book and see which one you prefer best yourself. There's also even an option to take the average of the 2, because one is a bit more conservative, one is a bit more liberal. That's also something people sometimes do. All those options are basically fine, as long as you just report what you did. Then you're just good to go, right? Then, as I said, in this example, there's also this between subject effect, in this case of age group again. And this the result for this factor you get in a separate box because it's a between participants effect. So here you get the main effect for age groups. And here you see in this example, for instance, that is not significant. So there was no significant effect of age group here in this experiment. So basically meaning, let's assume there were two age groups here, just a group of young people, a group of old people. Since there is no significant effect of age group, this means that those two groups basically did not differ from each other overall. So if there's a significant interaction effect, it could be the case that they differ on a specific condition. But if you look at everything together, the whole pattern, if you overall compare group 1 to group 2 in terms of their age group now, there are no significant differences. Right, and for those between subject factors, like last week, you can test for this Levines, you can check for this Levines test. Basically here, it's relevant for your different dependent variables, there's actually whether there's actually a significant effect here or not. If those values are not significant, then you don't have to go through any kind of correction. If one of those values here is significant, so if it's lower than 0.05, then you can correct your F value and your degrees of freedom. And in the book, you can find how to do this. There are a couple of different options. And again, you can pick just one, the one you prefer, or the one that's maybe easiest, as long as you just report what you have done to correct it. Again, any field says ignore this complete Levines test and always correct. But I leave this to you. See what you would prefer. As long as you report what you have done, then you're fine. All right, that was actually already the content for this week. So it was a bit shorter because many things overlapped already with the Factorial ANOVA last week. This is also to compensate, I guess, to the first 2 weeks where the actual digital lecture was a bit longer than the regular 45 minutes in which I would typically present this in class. I've been thinking about why this is the case, but I think normally, of course, I can typically see people in front of me nodding or so, which is not the case now. So I sort of have the feeling that I'm trying to explain everything in 4 different ways now. And that's that's why it's taking a bit longer. But as long as you learn from it, I'm perfectly happy with that. Right. So typically now there will be a 15-minute break, and then after the break, students will be doing the in-class assignment for week 3. As you know by now, this in-class assignment is on Canvas for you to carry out, and I've also put the correct answers on Canvas again for you to check whether everything you did worked out well. So let's finish again with this overview for this week. So this is the topic, as you know by now. In terms of readings, there are again 2 chapters, but those are actually, and that's the good news, the final chapters. So after this week, you've read all the chapters that you would have to read, and then the coming weeks you will just practice with the things that you basically already know. Again, if you need them, there are some more Andy Field videos on YouTube for some more clarification if things are unclear in my lecture or if you find things unclear in the book. Right, there's this lecture for this week, which you've now watched. And as I said, there's this in-class assignment. Yeah, so as I said before, the first 3 weeks in this course are quite intense. So many different topics, many chapters to read, many videos to watch. After those first 3 weeks, things will become way more straightforward. No new topics, just more practice to repeat the things that you already know, hopefully, such that you actually acquire those skills of carrying out those analyses yourself and reporting them, etc. And obviously, don't forget assignment 1, right? So at the end of the deadline for assignment 1 is the end of the 3rd week. So find it on Canvas, work on it. As I said before, after having studied for the 3rd week and having done the regular activities, that will be a good moment to work on the 3rd case in this assignment. In this assignment 1, the first 2 cases you can already start. I hope you've already started doing them after week 2. And once you do them, you'll probably understand why I'm saying this. All right, so that's it from my side for this week. I hope you learned something again, and I'll stop sharing my screen, put this online again, and of course, as always, please, if you have any question, please join the Q&A session during the regular scheduled course time slot. And also always feel free to send me an email if you're stuck, if anything's unclear, if you have any question, and then I'll try to reply to this as soon as I can. All right, and then I will be in touch soon, I guess, via email or again via Zoom.